The wind on Pen-y-Ghent never truly rests. It rolls over the Yorkshire hills in long, unbroken breaths, carrying the scent of wet earth and the sharp tang of stone. On most days, it belongs only to hikers and sheep, to the quiet rhythm of the countryside. But on one day in September 2004, the wind carried something else, whispers of a body found where no one was meant to lie. She was discovered near the slopes, the ground around her uneven, the sky wide and pale above her. No bag, no identification, no coat against the cold. Just a wedding ring on her hand, smooth and unmarked, as if it had been chosen to belong to no one. The hill stood silent around her, as though they'd been holding this secret for longer than anyone knew. A woman in death, but a bride in the story the ring refused to tell. You're not supposed to know her name. Most Americans don't. But if you believe every bride story deserves to be told, even after the world has forgotten her, subscribe, share, and stay with me until the end. Because this is where her voice begins again. At first, she was not Lamduan Armitage. She was the Lady of the Hills, a name given by strangers to soften the blunt truth of her anonymity. Police sketches could only guess at her smile. News reports struggled to hold attention after the first wave of curiosity passed. The world is quick to forget women it doesn't recognise. Quicker still when their stories do not fit into neat, comfortable boxes. She had no visible wounds, no signs of struggle. But the absence of violence did not mean the absence of a story. Somewhere, in the gap between her last living breath and the day her body was found, the truth waited. The ring too waited, slipped onto her finger once with ceremony or love, now clinging to skin that could no longer tell its meaning. It is easy, standing here in the present, to think of her as only the woman in the photograph, or worse, the outline on a coroner's report. But once she had been a bride. Once she had chosen, or been chosen, to wear that ring. Somewhere, she had stood before people and promised to belong. Somewhere, there were moments when she laughed, when she woke to the sound of someone she trusted moving in the kitchen, when she packed a small bag for a new life in a new place. The hills do not care about such details, but people should, because without them, all that's left is the cold. And the cold is not enough to carry a life's worth of meaning. No one can say what she thought about in those last hours on the hill, if she was afraid, if she was numb, if she believed she would walk back down. But there is something unbearable in the fact that the only witness to her final moments was the wind, and the only proof of her life left in that place was a ring that didn't even carry her name. That kind of silence does not happen by accident. It is made piece by piece, choice by choice, until a person's identity is erased long before their body is. The mystery of the hills is not how she died. It is how she came to be alone there, nameless in life's records, claimed only by the landscape. And it is in that question, how did she end up here, that her story truly begins. In the small village where Lamduan grew up, mornings began with the sound of roosters and the slow hum of voices drifting from open windows. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and cooked rice, and the narrow paths between houses were worn smooth by generations of bare feet. She belonged to this place in the way a tree belongs to its soil, rooted, familiar, certain of where she stood. Her family knew every detail of her life, from the friends she walked to school with to the way she tilted her head when she listened. She dreamed simply but vividly, to teach, to travel, to see more than the stretch of sky above her home. She believed those dreams would come slowly, carried to her in seasons. She never imagined they would arrive all at once in the shape of a man she barely knew. David Armitage came into her life like an unexpected change in the weather. Warm at first, then unpredictable. He was foreign in every sense of the word, pale-skinned, confident in ways that seemed theatrical in her village, his words heavy with an accent she could only partially understand. To her, he seemed like a door into a bigger world. He spoke of England as though it were a place where opportunities were handed to you just for being brave enough to take them. He made promises in gestures as much as in words, a hand over hers at the market, a steady gaze in front of her parents, a ring that glittered brighter than anything she'd worn. And when he asked her to marry him, the decision felt less like a question and more like a current pulling her forward. The wedding was small but restless, filled with the unspoken tension of two families who knew their lives would now stretch across oceans. Her parents' smiles were tinged with the sadness of goodbye. Friends embraced her with laughter that caught in their throats. She told herself the lump in her own throat was excitement. She thought of England as a storybook she'd been invited to live inside, streets lined with stone, houses warm against the cold, a life where her future was no longer confined to the same few square miles. And so she left, carrying the weight of her family's hopes in her suitcase. But the first days in the UK were not the fairy tale she had rehearsed in her mind. The air was sharper, the sky more often grey than blue. The language around her was constant and fast, leaving her trailing behind in conversations. David's world was not the village street where neighbours called out her name. It was quiet rooms where she knew no one, cities where she was invisible. She told herself she would adjust, that this was simply the cost of change. What she didn't see, what no one told her, was how easily isolation can grow roots in unfamiliar ground, and how quickly those roots can tighten. She thought this was a beginning. She didn't know it was the start of her ending. England was colder than she imagined, and not just in temperature. Days blurred into each other beneath a sky that seemed permanently muted. The village where she lived with David was not unkind, but it was indifferent. A place where people kept to themselves, nodding politely, but never lingering long enough to learn who she truly was. She learned to smile in short bursts, to nod without speaking when she couldn't find the words quickly enough. Conversations felt like stepping into a river that moved too fast for her to keep her balance. And so she stopped stepping in. Neighbours would later recall her as quiet, reserved. "Always with him," one woman said to reporters years later. She didn't seem unhappy, just closed. Another remembered how she seemed almost startled if addressed directly, glancing to David before replying. It wasn't that she was unfriendly, she simply moved as if there were invisible boundaries marking where she could and couldn't go. The small freedom she once took for granted, visiting friends, walking to the market, deciding when to come home, seemed to vanish without a clear moment of loss. David preferred to handle the shopping. He paid the bills, kept the car keys in his pocket, and spoke for both of them when they were out. "It's easier this way," he'd say if she asked. And in the beginning she believed him. It was easier not to stumble through sentences in a language that still felt too large for her mouth, easier to avoid the embarrassment of being misunderstood. But ease has a way of becoming dependence. When she wanted to call her family, she had to ask. When she needed money, she waited for him to offer it, and slowly her world contracted to the size of their home, a place where the curtains stayed drawn most of the day, and the television filled the silence. Friends did not visit. Neighbours stopped trying. She began to recognise the seasons only by the angle of light through the window. There were moments, small and scattered, that hinted at something beneath the surface. A raised voice behind a closed door, a walk cut short after an offhand comment. Once, a neighbour saw her standing in the garden alone, her coat pulled tight, her gaze fixed on something far away. She looked different, the woman said later, like she knew something was about to change. Inside the house, that change was quieter, but no less present. Her days became a series of careful choices. What tone to use, what questions not to ask, when to speak, and when to stay silent. The wrong choice could turn a room cold, could stretch an evening into something brittle and airless. She learned to read the subtle signs in David's movements, the way his jaw tightened when he was tired, the set of his shoulders when he was thinking of money. She adjusted herself accordingly, shrinking her needs to fit the space she was allowed. From the outside, theirs was an ordinary marriage. From the inside, it was a life lived in shadows, where her reflection in the mirror began to look less like herself and more like the version he wanted others to see. And in that reflection, the space for her own thoughts, her own choices, grew smaller every day. The morning she was last seen began without ceremony. The sky was the colour of unpolished steel, and the air held that sharp, almost metallic edge that comes before rain. In the small village below the hills, a few people remember glimpsing her, a flash of dark hair beneath a hood, her coat buttoned to the throat. Some say she looked determined, walking with a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be. Others recall a hesitation in her step, as though each movement required its own decision. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going. The road toward Pen-y-Ghent is not forgiving. It rises gradually at first, then steepens without warning, the path narrowing into a ribbon of uneven stone and damp grass. The wind grows bolder the higher you climb, tugging at clothing, forcing you to brace with each step. That day, it carried the scent of wet earth from the previous night's rain. Her boots left faint impressions in the soft ground, each one shallow enough to be erased by the next gust. Somewhere along the route, the village fell away behind her, replaced by the vast empty moor. Why she went remains the question that has never been fully answered. Some believe she chose the hills deliberately, seeking solitude or escape. Others suspect she was not alone, that someone led her there step by step, until turning back no longer felt like an option. Theories swirl, but the truth is that only the hills know whether she climbed them willingly or was taken. By the time she reached the exposed slopes, the cold would have been constant, pressing through her coat, numbing her fingers. The wind at that height doesn't speak in whispers. It roars, drowning out thought. It's the kind of place where you can feel entirely unseen, even if someone is watching. No one saw her after that. No one saw the moment her journey ended. Hours later, long after she should have returned, hikers moving along the trail noticed something against the rough grass, a shape that didn't belong. The light was fading, the sky bleeding into early evening, when they realized it was a body. She lay still, her face turned slightly away, her hair tangled by the wind. There was no bag, no phone, no wallet, only a wedding ring, smooth and unmarked, clinging to her finger. This is the moment where everything could have been stopped. If anyone had been watching, if someone had asked why she was walking alone toward the hills, if one more set of eyes had caught that flicker of something in her expression. But the hills keep their own counsel, and the wind that might have carried her voice away has never returned it. By the time help arrived, there was nothing left to do but take her down the path she had climbed alone, carrying with her a silence that no one yet knew how to name. The hikers who found her waited in the fading light, their jackets pulled tight against the wind, until the first police officers reached the slope. The scene was quiet, a kind of quiet that feels heavier than sound. Officers moved carefully, speaking in low voices, marking the ground with yellow flags where footprints broke the grass. A paramedic checked for signs of life, but the cold had already claimed her. There was no bag to search, no phone to scroll through, no scrap of paper with a name. Her pockets were empty. Her coat, zipped to the throat, carried no label. Even the ring on her finger offered nothing. No engraving, no date, no clue to who had given it to her or why. In the first hours, they tried to map her identity through the few things she wore. A brown jacket, black trousers, walking boots. None of it stood out. There was nothing to connect her to a home, a family, or a story. Her face was photographed, her features measured and recorded, but every detail was just a piece of a puzzle without edges. She was not missing from any list they had. She was not reported by anyone who might have known where she'd been. The hills had given them a body but no name to place on it. When the investigation stalled, procedure took over. Days passed, then weeks, and the hope of someone stepping forward began to fade. Without a name, there could be no letters to send, no calls to make to the people who might have loved her. In time, the local council arranged her burial. It was not the kind of funeral where stories are told and faces are wet with grief. The grave was unmarked, the soil turned over without ceremony, watched only by a few officials. They could not write her name on the stone because they didn't know it. Instead, the press gave her one, the Lady of the Hills. It was a name born of distance, a way to speak about her without admitting how little they knew. Articles were written, sketches circulated, and for a while her face appeared on bulletin boards and in shop windows. People glanced, some lingered, but no one claimed her, and so the Lady of the Hills faded into the category of mysteries the world stops trying to solve. Her name would not be spoken again for years, not until the truth began to surface, and by then, the hills had kept her longer than anyone ever should have. The investigation did not stop abruptly. It thinned, like a voice fading at the end of a sentence. In the months after her burial, the case files grew heavier with reports that led nowhere. A sighting in Scotland proved false. A missing person in Germany was quickly ruled out. Each new lead promised a flicker of recognition, only to dissolve under closer inspection. The Lady of the Hills remained a headline without a story, a photograph without a history to hold it up. Detectives reached beyond England, sending her image to police in other countries. They wrote to embassies, posted her likeness on international missing persons lists. Artists shaped her face again and again, softening a jawline here, adjusting the tilt of the eyes there, hoping someone would see themselves in the clay and call her home. For a brief time, those reconstructions drew attention, each one sparking theories in online forums and short news segments. But attention is a currency that runs out quickly. As the years passed, her presence slipped from the front pages. The media moved on to fresher tragedies. Files were boxed, and her name, if anyone had known it, was still absent from every line of every report. Yet she remained in that unmarked grave at Horton in Ribblesdale. The soil settled now, grass beginning to grow over the turned earth. Visitors to the nearby cemetery sometimes paused at the spot, recognizing it from an old article, unsure what to do in front of a life they'd never known. The hills themselves seemed unchanged, still rolling under the same restless wind. But for those who remembered her, they carried an unease, because they had held her for days before she was found, and for years after, they still held the answer no one could reach. It was as though the landscape had been written into her silence, the way a diary holds a story without ever showing the ink. It is here the story could have ended, sealed in the cold permanence of not knowing. She could have remained the Lady of the Hills forever, her real life erased as completely as her name. But the hills remember, and so did someone else. Somewhere far from England, in another country entirely, a family still wondered why their daughter had stopped writing, why her calls had gone quiet, why her absence had become an unspoken grief. And in time, the space between these questions and this grave began to close. The break came quietly, years after most had stopped expecting one. In 2019, police received the results of a DNA comparison arranged through Interpol. A family in Thailand had provided samples after hearing a news report about an unidentified woman found in the English hills. The match was immediate. The Lady of the Hills had a name, Lamduan Armitage. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman who had once left her village full of hope. The name pulled her back into the world of the living, but it also opened questions far heavier than the mystery of her identity. Her family confirmed what investigators had never known, that she'd married an Englishman, David Armitage, and moved to the UK in the late 1990s. They hadn't heard from her in years. Letters had stopped, calls had ceased. They had been left to wonder if life abroad had simply carried her away, as it sometimes does. Now they knew it had carried her somewhere else entirely. News outlets ran the story again, this time with her real name and photographs from her life before England. The contrast was jarring. Lamduan smiling in a sunlit yard dressed in soft colours, her hair loose over her shoulders against the stark image of the Yorkshire hills where her body was found. The gap between who she had been and how she was found could not be explained by time alone. For years, the official cause of her death remained uncertain. There were whispers of hypothermia, of possible foul play, of unanswered questions about how she had ended up so far from home and without the means to return. Each possibility seemed to circle back to the life she'd shared with David. And in early 2025, the story turned again. David Armitage was arrested on suspicion of her murder. Authorities have not yet revealed the full case against him. But the arrest itself has shifted the weight of the story. For those who have followed her case, it is not yet justice. It is the beginning of the chance for it. Lamduan is no longer just the Lady of the Hills. She is a woman whose life had a before and an after, whose ending may yet be understood. And now, with her name restored, there is no turning back to silence. The ring was the only thing she carried up the hill, the single trace of a life that had been joined to another. Smooth, unmarked, it told no one where it had come from or when it had been given. It was a symbol meant to speak of commitment, yet it held no inscription, no private words etched into its surface. In the end, it was as silent as the woman who wore it. That silence is what kept her invisible for so long, not just in death, but in life. Her story is not only about a mystery in the hills, it is about what happens when a person becomes smaller in someone else's shadow, when distance from family and community allows control to take root unnoticed. Isolation is not always built of locked doors. Sometimes it is built from days without choices, from a voice unused until it forgets its own sound. That kind of silence can be as deadly as any weapon. We remember Lamduan Armitage now, not because the ring spoke for her, but because her name finally did. And names matter. They anchor a life to the truth that it was lived. If you believe that stories like hers should not fade into cold files and forgotten graves, share this one. Let her voice travel farther than the wind on Pen-y-Ghent. Let it reach the ears of those who might otherwise be lost to silence.